There we go. We were at one of the real estate boards this morning. We had a full house there for you, and we were speaking about home inspections. And we'll start with you, Mark. Of course, a little bit of a background. You have a degree in building, is that correct?
Yeah, actually I got several, but yeah, master's degree in construction engineering, construction technology.
Okay, so when we send you out, after the real estate community has received a home inspection, oftentimes they ask, the home inspector oftentimes knows when he or she is in over their head, right? In terms of, you better see a specialist on this issue, whether it's draining or foundation and the like.
Yep. Typically what happens is they'll see an issue that's out of compliance with something. A lot of times it's an older structure, and what they'll typically recommend is see, this is beyond the scope of this inspection, see a specialist.
Now, you don't go out there to kill the deal, right?
Oh, heck no. No way. Our parents are realtors. We know how hard it is to put together a deal and keep it through.
Okay, we're going to speak to Big Brother. Now, Tim, we had, oftentimes the real estate community talks about that specialist, and oftentimes, well, we need a structural engineer, or we need an architect and things. Can you talk about the different levels of specialist?
Right. In the residential real estate market, you'll hear structural engineer. You have to have a structural engineer look at this, but really that's a misnomer, because a structural engineer is a special engineer that has got his professional engineering license and then has gone beyond that. And most structural engineers are bridge engineers and high-rise engineers, those types. In the residential and light commercial, really what's meant is that you need a professional engineer. You need a licensed engineer who's competent in this type of work. And usually that's a civil engineer like me who practices structures mostly. I mean, that's my specialty. And so when they ask for a structural, that's generally what they mean, though they're asking kind of the wrong question.
Now, Mark, I know you've both been up and down the peninsula here working with the different cities. Oftentimes you will go to a property and, for instance, you've had seminars which you've put on called a flip gone bad.
Oh yeah.
Right? So when you have these, whether it's a Band-Aid or an actual flip of a property, and you have to go and make this whole again. Can you speak to that issue? Well,
it boils down to, a lot of times with the flip, they want to go in, buy it cheap, put some paint on it, and then turn around and make profit. And if the market's right, oftentimes you get the market timing, you know that better than anybody, Pat, but what happens a lot is that they'll go in and they don't hire an engineer, they don't use a licensed contractor, they'll go in and do the work themselves, they'll hire unlicensed people, and oftentimes the work they do is either substandard and or egregiously substandard. And so now what you've got is a flip that was done so poorly, the work that was done on it to improve it, that you have a hazard.
Right.
And when it refers to structural items like Tim was talking about, it can be significant.
Okay, Tim, we had spoken this morning about, for instance, a saggy roof. And by the way, a lot of buyers, especially in hot markets and their agents, will elect not to have inspections, which is a little bit of a train wreck. And then they move into the home, and then their neighbor comes over and said, boy, did Bob ever tell you about that saggy roof? He's really had a lot of roofers over there over the last 10, 15 years. Let's talk about the saggy roof, for instance.
Okay.
You see that a lot.
Yeah, that's pretty common, and the reason for that is that a lot of older homes were built back in the day before engineers ever even thought about, even before building codes actually a lot of times. And so to size a roof rafter, the guy with the hammer and the nail pouch said, yeah, 2x4 ought to work for that, let's put 2x4s up there.
Right.
And really not understanding what he was doing in terms of structural integrity of that roof. And it was good enough to last without falling down all these years, but because it's overspanned, the roof starts to sag. And that's just an indication the wood is telling us, hey, you guys have put too much load for too long a span, and now I'm starting to fail. And I would not want to buy a house myself if it had that problem.
Now, Mark, how would you address that? You've been called out by the roofer, the roofing report, or the home inspection report, and the parties involved do want to correct the roof.
No,
What's
usually
stage one?
what happens is there's something wrong. So for example, they want to store materials up in the roof, and they'll say, hey, this was called out on the report. We have a sag or deflection in there. And you know, I'll go out there and look at it and find that it's egregiously under-designed to meet current building code. So back when the carpenter built it in 1954 approximately, when the building code was implemented universally throughout the Northern Bay Area, by the way.
I see.
So prior to that time, it could have been built by anybody, and it could have been built with a building permit. It was acceptable at that time. So now that you go out to repair that, we're gonna have to take that building, that roof, and bring it to current building code. So then in that case, we would give the information, put it together. Tim would take that and he would size everything to the appropriate size, and then we would go down and apply for a building permit to do that upgrade. It would either be voluntary or we could be doing that as part of a remodel or something.
Okay.
But that's kind of a big deal, because in order to fix that right, you're probably going to have to add some support somewhere to those rafters. Okay, well, that support has got to come down and bear on something below it, and it's usually a ceiling. Well, the ceiling was probably built overspanned also. So now you're adding load to something else that already is a problem. So it's not just a simple matter of putting a few sticks and posts here and there. You have to trace the loads all the way down through the structure. Make sure you find a bearing wall somewhere, and if there's none, you have to put beams in and then take it down to a footing that may or may not be there. So it can be a big deal if somebody wants to fix it and do it right.
Okay, so for the lay people in the audience, the overspan, what does overspan mean from?
Right, so let's say you've got a 2x4, which is a piece of lumber, and a 2x4 on a rafter should probably span no more than about 10 feet. So from the heel, from the wall to the peak, let's say, that should be no more than about 10 feet if it's a 2x4, roughly. Well, we've seen them 16 feet, 18 feet, they don't even make 2x4s that long anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't have trees that tall anymore.
Well, take your pick,
Okay.
but that one is going to have a nice bow in it in time.
Okay, now you stole my thunder there, Tim, because we also have in our industry the saggy roof. All right, so we had the saggy roof, the saggy ceiling.
Yeah, right, it's a different deal.
Okay.
Was that your thunder?
You stole my thunder, so.
All right.
Yeah, and then you mentioned bearing wall and footing. So how
Right.
does that tie in for the lay people that?
Right, so what it comes down to is when you see sags at the ceiling or at the roof, that means there's too much weight up there for too long a span. So to fix that, usually the best way is to add supports somewhere near the middle of that. Well, that's usually a wall down below. And when you do that and you support your ceiling or roof, now that wall is called a bearing wall. And that load now comes down through the wall and it's on a floor, and now the load doesn't go away. It has to get all the way to dirt sooner or later, because the ground is what supports all of this.
Sure.
And so where the wall hits the floor, if there's no footing under that, we have to take a look at now the floor joists, the floorboards. Can they take the load that we're now bringing new load to them? And maybe they can and maybe they can't, but you can't know that unless you take a look at it.
So let's go back for the people in the audience that are in the middle of a transaction or they're thinking of selling their house. And it's always a good idea, we spoke about that this morning at our meeting, then you had a meeting in the afternoon with home inspectors, that the seller gets inspections before they put a sign on the lawn.
I think it's out. Well, number one, it's taking that a little further. I think number one, always get inspections. That's critically important. One of the issues we had this morning is who do you call? And our recommendation is that you call a qualified, experienced home inspector that is a member of an organization such as ASHI or CREA. And those are the guys that are going to be doing this for a living. And they're experienced, and they're typically going to be, the recommendation of the realtor. And this as good as anybody. That's your first piece, and that's to get them out there to get a general inspection, and then they're going to find stuff potentially, and that's when we would come in or some other specialist.
Okay, and ASHI And do you
American
wanna-
Society of Home Inspectors and Korea's California Real Estate Inspection Association.
Okay, and then home inspectors usually belong to one or the other.
They do one or the other or both, and they're required to get continuing education units. They have testing, and it's a thorough, comprehensive. It's elective, and the state of California is one of the states that does not require licensure for home inspectors. So,
Okay. Now that's what we spoke about before, or I mentioned this morning at the meeting, is that real estate attorneys tell me that 80 to 90% of the claims, it's the buyer going after the big bad seller. And 80–90% of those claims is a bad house case or failure to disclose, and there's a lot of issues that didn't come up.
I would agree with that.
Now, that said, it's great to have these conversations before a sale is finished. So
Heck
we're in
yeah.
the living room, we're discovering these issues, and you have to tactfully describe the facts to the buyer or the seller or the realtors involved, correct?
Yeah. And you know, it's like we've inspected between Tim and I 15, 20,000 buildings and homes. I mean, this is pretty
Wow.
routine. So the bottom line is it's everybody wants to know. They want to get their arms around it. The issue is oftentimes just disclose it. Find out. Get your arms around the issue. Everything's fixable. It's a matter of time and money and the difficulty of doing the work maybe if you're living in the house. But
Sure.
that's the real issue. And you know, we were talking interestingly enough about that load path that Tim was talking about. And one of the flip gone bad, it was a home where they had removed an interior bearing wall and there was all these cracks in the ceiling coming out, and the person who had done that work selling the home didn't disclose that. But the buyer was in his contingency period, brought me in on the advice of the realtor, and of course we found that kind of an issue, and that's what we're talking about.
So a contingency, of course, is the buyer's right to walk away and get their deposit,
Correct.
which is when you want to discover these issues.
You bet.
Okay, speaking of contingency period, oftentimes, Tim, during the sale, during the investigation time of a sale, the first 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever, the inspections and the agents will note that there's a lot of cracks in the ceiling or the walls. Can you
Yeah.
speak to that issue?
Yeah, well, so when you have cracks in your drywall or your plaster, whether it's a ceiling or a wall, that almost always means that there's movement of some sort of the structure. So it's either settling, and that's not good, or it has been tweaked pretty hard by an earthquake, which shook it violently during the earthquake, cracked these hard surfaces, and maybe it's okay now, but maybe it has caused some damage that needs to be looked at, needs to be fixed at this point. So those are indicators that something about the structure has gone wrong to some degree. Maybe it's not a big deal, but maybe it is, and you wouldn't know that unless you look at it or have somebody, a specialist, look at it.
Now, the bouncy floors, we see this a lot. Of course, it was the areas that we work here, San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, you go up and down the peninsula. The homes are older, and perhaps there's been some settling. We'll get into that in a bit. But what is a bouncy floor?
I'm going to defer that to Tim because that's really an engineering question.
Okay.
Well, you know what a bouncy floor is when you walk on it, because kind of my test is you get somebody sitting in a chair here and somebody walking across the floor here. Well, if the guy or the gal in the chair's coffee dances around and he starts doing this, that's a bouncy floor. Or if your kids can double the floor as a trampoline, well, that's a bouncy issue.
Right,
Okay,
right.
but the thing about that is that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a structural hazard. What that means is that the floor joists or the boards that hold up the floor are overspanned, and there's that word again. They took a 2x6, which should span no more than 8 feet between supports, and they spanned it 12 or 14. And that's way too far for that 2x6 to take that load. And so it's going to be bouncy, and the bounciness is an indicator that there's something wrong here. And as I said, it might not be a structural hazard, but it certainly is uncomfortable, and it's a trigger. Hey, we need to look at this.
Okay. Now, in terms of if somebody insisted on fixing those,
It's a real easy thing.
Is it?
that's-
Okay.
yeah. Bounciness is typically, just like Tim referred to earlier, is somewhere in the center area of that point between the two bearing areas of that joist or board or whatever, is putting another engineered stiffener in there of some kind to take that bounce and get rid of it. Piece of
Okay.
cake.
Now, in terms of the poor quality construction, we have a lot of people that have been working on homes with or without a license. Maybe the seller has been doing those repairs. And we have to re-engineer these repairs. Can you speak to those issues? I mean, if let's say there's a home inspection, there's a sale going on, you have agents involved, transaction going on, how do we tactfully handle these repairs?
Well, you know, most of the time you don't see that, but what you do see a lot is homeowners doing a lot of work, and a lot of it stems from people don't really know what has to be permitted, what doesn't. I like to say anything that's health, life, or safety, which would be electrical, mechanical, plumbing, and structure, has to be permitted when it's repaired 99% of the time, with very few exceptions. And when I say repaired, typically most jurisdictions, which is the county, the city, if you're in the city of, say, San Jose, or the city of Los Gatos, or the city of Hillsborough, whatever, they require a licensed professional engineer to do the drawing, or a licensed architect, minimally a licensed professional. And then you submit that drawing, you get the approval on that, and then you take that permit, do the work. It gets inspected again by a third-party city inspector and maybe a specialist too. That's a very thorough, comprehensive, well-planned out process. You don't get many mistakes when you do that. But when you get a cowboy out there doing the work, no deference to cowboys, but you get somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, and they do the work and they do a poor job, then you get this issue, and it happens a lot.
Well, we can tell, usually, when we crawl under a house or we go into an attic and we see repair work that's been done, we can tell whether or not it's been permitted.
Yeah.
Because if it was permitted, somebody actually drew a plan, they took it down to the building department, had the plan reviewed, and during the work, the building department came and inspected and make sure they did a good job. Most of the stuff that we see out there is not like that. And that's what causes the stop of the sale, because when we're inspecting, or any home inspector sees that kind of work, that shoddy work, the flag has to go up and closer examination has to be made.
Now, we mentioned permits. We spoke a lot about that this morning. You have mentioned over the years that I've known you that you replace a fence, you need a permit. Replace the cabinets, you need a permit.
Permits are prevalent on almost every item of your normal home that you do. You know, and most people don't know that. Like, for example, they'll replace their kitchen cabinets. Well, you're supposed to go down and get a permit for that. Not the cabinet doors, but the cabinets themselves. And they want you to upgrade also when you do the work. So you remodel a bathroom, you remodel your kitchen, you replace your cabinets. They want you to upgrade the necessary electrical and lighting, et cetera, as part of that.
Boy, there are a lot of people that are against permits. They speak about it as if it's poison oak or something. It's just completely negative.
Well, yeah, I mean, well, there's the good and the bad. You know, we actually like to work with the city jurisdictions because we believe that they provide a good service, provided that they are providing a good service, and that's a negotiable item as well. Sometimes we don't have good experiences there, and that creates a lot of the stigma. But the theory and the concept is that they provide a good service to bring this third-party inspection and credibility to the deal. It keeps everybody honest, in theory. Now, I will admit that there have been many a time when the work has not been inspected properly, and it's very challenging to get the permits. That's a well-known fact, I'd say.
I think probably the most important, or one of the most important reasons for getting a permit is because sooner or later, you're going to have to disclose that when you sell your house.
Absolutely.
Did you get a permit for this addition? Did you get a permit for that structural repair in your attic? And you have to disclose those types of things, and if you got a permit, now you're clean, and it's an easy, there's no stop to the sale.
Plus it adds value.
Absolutely.
So it's a little bit of a hassle, but it adds value.
Right.
Now, let's get back to that poor construction or repairs here. There's a lot of, you mentioned people are drilling into wood where they shouldn't have, or these different issues, putting holes in framing without proper reinforcement.
Well, I want to talk about that specifically, what Tim was saying earlier. Where we find the most problems is where people don't normally look, and that's in the crawl spaces or the lower areas that are hard to get access to, and in the attics, bottom line. If it's in the kitchen or a very visible area, typically,
see it.
Yeah. But where we spend most of our time in structural inspections is in those two areas. And that's where we find 80–90% of the problems, because no one goes down there to inspect it, especially if there's no permit, there's no engineered drawing, there's no follow through by some third party to go in there and verify that the work is done correctly. And we see that a lot.
Yeah, here's a great example. So let's say you've got a house and you want to add a bathroom, or you want to remodel your bathroom, and that involves changing some plumbing. Well, that's not a big deal. You know, my Uncle Hank, he's a plumber, he can come over and do this. And so Hank comes over and he reroutes the pipes, but now a pipe can't get to the sewer line because there's a joist or a beam in the way. So what does Hank do? Well, he whips out his Sawzall and he just hacks a great big hole in the beam. Hey, got the pipe, sewer runs downhill, right? Well, this is going downhill, everything's great. Until we come along and we notice, hey, this is really bouncy around this toilet here. What's going on? And you go down and half of the beam is gone.
Right,
Bang.
there we go.
Yeah, big flag. Now we got to go in there and we got to fix that.
Now that's getting back to flips. A lot of times we have what's termite damage or water damage in bathrooms, and the people that do these flips, they will put a new bathroom over an old bathroom,
Oh, yeah.
so to speak.
That's a good subject, and that's probably more than we're going to get into on this show. But a lot of times they'll cover, like what Tim was talking about, sagging roofs earlier. Well, a lot of times they layer roofing on there, and it adds weight, and you can hide stuff. And the same thing on covering up flooring. And on flips, what we find typically, not always, sometimes you get very qualified people, but we see a lot, especially when we're brought into a distressed situation. So the developer bought the home, they started working on it, they rushed through the finish, they didn't get permits. Now we're going to find stuff almost every time. 90% of the time we're going to see some significant issues, and a lot of it's like that. They cover it up, they paint over it, they don't go down there, they don't get any inspections, and the work gets shoddy.
What about when, for instance, there is an inspector on site? What would trigger a full code or a structural upgrade?
So in other words, you're going through a sale, let's say, or a refi, and you've got to have an inspection. So somebody comes on there and they look and they find some of these issues that we're talking about.
Right. Whether there's a sale or not, when they come on site, I know you've mentioned that before, sometimes it triggers a full.
Well, usually a full structural upgrade is only triggered when you do a remodel or an addition, and part of that affects part of the existing structure more than about 5%. So let's say you do an addition and you are adding a room. Well, where that room connects to the existing structure, maybe you've got to cut into the roof to make the new ceiling and the roof fit. Well, you have affected a chunk of the existing house significantly. That affected part has to be brought up to current code. The rest of the house was not affected, so that's maybe good news that you don't have to address that. But where you affect existing 5% or more, that has to be brought up to current code. That's right out of the building code.
Okay, one thing that we've seen more and more with the Great Recession is families teaming up or people converting their garage to an apartment.
Well, we see a lot of conversions of a lot of different stuff, and when you're talking about that, what I think you're getting into here is whether it's it's converted with permits, and it's done where you actually convert this into actual living space. You do pull permits, and you follow the rules, so to speak, and we've seen that many times, not just in garages, but in outbuildings, storage buildings. And I'll be honest with you, we usually get involved when there is no permit or there's a problem with it. It was improved, like we just did an inspection a couple weeks ago on a rear sun porch that was actually built in 1956 as a sun porch.
Right.
But then they walled it in, put a heavy roof on it, and now all of a sudden the thing has a 4-inch settlement to one side of it. And it was never the foundation. There was virtually a sidewalk that now they turned into a foundation.
There's also when a building changes, the occupant of the building changes. For instance, if it was a retail institution and now it's turning into,
boy, I just worked with the Elks Club who bought a bank building, and it was built in the 70s, and they wanted to turn it into their Elk Lodge and do an addition and a remodel. And so the architect did all this design. Civil engineers did a bunch of work. I did a bunch of work. They submitted it to the city, and the city, in their judgment, said, you have changed the occupancy from a business to a place of gathering of potentially 300 or more people. And that triggered a complete structural upgrade of the complete building.
Wow.
Not just the part that we affected, like I just talked about that, but the entire rest of the building. And it was a deal killer for them. It sunk the whole project. And they spent a bunch of money up to that point, and I'm afraid they lost it.
Trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, well, they were unaware that a occupancy change triggers a humongous upgrade of the entire building, and that really stung them.
Okay. So in closing out here, in terms of permits, always recommend get some permits?
Well, you're required by law to get them, so the answer is yeah. The thing is to know what they're required for and to get the right people involved to help you if you don't.
Okay, Tim and Mark Garrison, the Garrison Brothers. What your company name
MG Constructors and Engineers.
and yours?
And I work under what I call the builder's engineer.
That's a trademark, so we can't use it. Thank you again for watching Kapowich on Real Estate. This is a program dedicated to consumer protection within the residential real estate arena. We will see you next week, same time, same channel. Thanks for watching.